Hello again. We're picking up right where we left off, talking more about inequality in America. Compared to other industrialized nations, the U.S. has relatively high inequalities of income and wealth. Again, a quick graphic to kind of make the point. Here we're looking at how much richer are the richest 20% in each country than the poorest 20%. Basically, it's a very simple ratio of incomes of the top quintile to the bottom quintile. In many industrialized countries, those ratios are moderately low. For example, in Japan, those in the top 20% earn about 3.4 times as much on average compared to people in the bottom 20%. You'll also see that in many Scandinavian countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and so forth, also fairly low ratios indicating less inequality in terms of the income distribution. Now, where's the United States? Well, we're way over this side with a ratio of 8.5. In other words, people in the top 20% are earning about 8.5 times as much as people in the bottom 20%. Now that's a whole lot more than most European countries, more than Canada, more than Australia. In fact, the U.S. is actually fairly similar to places like Singapore, which are not places that you tend to associate with high levels of income inequality. So once again, the U.S. appears to have fairly high levels of relative income inequality. I have to stress the latter. Relative income inequality, because you're looking at how, well, income is distributed in a relative sense across a large population. That's not the same thing of talking about, well, how much money the average person has, or for that matter, how much money the poorest people have. Those have more to do with absolute comparisons of living standards or income. The U.S. looks much better if we focus more on making absolute as opposed to relative comparisons in terms of the living standards of the general population. This little graph comes from 2005. It's showing the absolute poverty rate of various populations in the industrialized world. You can see that if you try to hold the poverty level constant, all of a sudden the United States doesn't look all that bad. We're kind of in the middle of the pack here compared to other industrialized countries. Now, granted, many industrialized countries have lower poverty rates in absolute terms than the United States, but nevertheless, the United States, if you look at the average income of the poorest people in absolute terms, actually the United States appears to be doing better than countries like France, the United Kingdom, Australia, and a whole lot better than Italy. And bear in mind, this is data from the mid-2000s, long before the financial crisis caused so many problems in Southern Europe. So even back when Italy was doing a lot better, poor people in Italy had incomes that were significantly lower than poor people living in the United States. So by that comparison, the United States maybe looks quite a bit better. The U.S. is not alone, by the way, in experiencing rising inequalities. Income inequality is increasing within many countries around the world. These upward trends are being observed in most modern industrialized nations and also several large industrializing countries as well. And that's what this little graphic points out. Income inequality increased in most of these OECD countries. Here we're looking at Gini coefficients of income inequality from the mid-80s and late 2000s. Each of these little bars allows us to see how the Gini index for each of these countries changed over time. And you'll notice all these arrows pointing up, showing increasing income inequality in country after country. In Scandinavian countries like Norway and Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Czech Republic, Germany, Japan, Australia, Italy, the UK, Israel, Mexico, and of course the United States. Now, some of these countries, the arrows wind up being higher at the tail or at the top end, like the United States, suggesting the United States still has higher levels of inequality than a lot of these other countries. But nevertheless, the direction of change is pretty much the same across all these countries. Now, you can find a few exceptions where we've had decreasing inequality from the late 2000s compared to the mid-1980s in Turkey, in Greece, a small decrease in France, a tiny decrease in Hungary, a small decrease in Belgium. Some countries, some industrialized European countries and so forth, have seen small decreases. But you'll also notice that these decreases are really small. So even the exceptions to the rule just barely qualify as exceptions. The general rule is that you're seeing increasing inequality across the industrialized world. And by the way, in many industrializing developing countries like India and China, apparently you're seeing very rapid increases in inequality. So it's not just the industrialized world. Clearly something that's happening across the entire world is contributing to rising inequality, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere. Now, arguably, the increasing inequalities in income and wealth have been faster in the United States than in most other industrialized countries. But still, we are facing a problem that's very similar to most of the other industrialized countries. Up to this point, we've taken standard inequality statistics and trends pretty much on face value. Upon closer inspection, however, there are some good reasons to believe that our most commonly used statistics may exaggerate how much inequality there is and how fast it is rising. Here we have just a very short list of some of the reasons why income inequality in the U.S. may not be quite as bad as it looks on paper. For example, failure to adjust for differences in household size across social classes. We kind of bumped into that earlier, not with income, but consumption. Well, a very similar point shows up here with income. If you adjust for household sizes, generally you have more people in higher income households, less people on average in lower income households. That means inequality across households adjusted for size, when you compare income per person, those figures start looking a little less extreme, so inequality appears to decline a little. Problems with how income is defined or measured. Wow. That would take literally an entire lecture series to talk about, but let's just keep it real simple. How we measure income is really tricky. And frankly, a lot of standard statistics that are used in these income inequalities, graphs that we've looked at, calculations we've looked at, a lot of them, frankly, leave out a lot of very real income. For example, a lot of times welfare, various forms of government subsidies are not included in a lot of this data. A lot of times fringe benefits, non-cash income, doesn't show up. And a lot of that really begins to skew and distort income statistics. Now, this is a very controversial and complicated area, but the general rule seems to be that the more broadly you define income, the more equally income appears to be distributed. Making pre-tax versus post-tax comparisons, well, that one is not so tricky. The rich do pay a higher share of their income in taxes compared to middle income or lower income people. So, if you're really interested in how much people keep after they pay Uncle Sam, you probably should focus on post-tax comparisons of income between different households. And when you do that, well, post-tax comparisons of income tend to be more equally distributed than pre-tax comparisons. So when you're looking at this data, be very careful whether you're looking at pre-tax or post-tax comparisons. And finally, this one isn't really technically something that's telling you that there's less income inequality than meets the eye, but at least it kind of explains why we have some of the kind of inequality we have. And that's failure to adjust for differences in patterns of working across social classes. In other words, if you look at inequality across households and you control for the number of workers, the number of working hours, how many people work full-time, how many people work year-round, Well, not surprisingly, households that have more workers, working more hours, working full-time, and so forth, they earn more income. So if you control for the number of work hours, for example, income inequality becomes a lot easier to understand. In combination, these factors can combine to seriously overstate income inequality. And here we're going to look at a really old study, a study by Rector and Herderman from 1997, just to kind of illustrate the point. They found that those in the top 20% of income-earning households earned about $13.86 for every dollar earned by people in the bottom 20%. Again, that's way back in the 90s. During the mid-90s, but after adjusting for taxes, other sources of income, and differences in the number of persons per household, those in the top quintile earned about $4.23 for every dollar of income in the bottom quintile. In other words, after you adjust for things like household size, broader definitions of income, you adjust for taxes, what started out as almost 14 to 1 drops to a little over 4 to 1. Now, they weren't done yet. Lower income households tend to have fewer people working, just like we mentioned, compared to higher income households. And those from poorer households who do work are more likely to work part-time or only work part of the year. If one adjusted for the number of hours worked per household, the ratio of incomes between higher and lower income households drops even further to $3.18 at the top to $1 at the bottom. The more adjustments you make, the more income inequality shrinks. Of course, it's open to debate about how you should make these adjustments and which variables you should adjust for, but you can still make a fairly plausible, powerful argument that income inequality, properly adjusted, is quite a bit lower than it may first appear if you just use standard statistics. And that really you should make those adjustments because frankly you're no longer really comparing apples to apples. You need to work to make better, more logical comparisons. The point here is not that income inequality in the U.S., the point here is not that income inequality in the United States is not real, using a double negative, sorry about that. Clearly we have a great deal of social inequality. Look, nobody is suggesting that we don't have lots of inequality of income and even more inequality of wealth. We do have. Rather, the point here is that popular claims about income inequality appear to overstate the problem somewhat. Maybe they overstate the problem quite a bit. There are also reasons to believe that rising income inequality in recent decades may not have risen as much or as fast as is commonly claimed. Now that's something where we're going to have to kind of punt on that one. We don't have the time or energy to deal with every possible issue. But I will point out that there's all sorts of things that you need to adjust for. All sorts of things you need to consider when you're asking a very basic question like, well, how fast is inequality rising? Well, that actually is a fairly tricky problem. And again, you can make lots of technical measurement, methodological arguments to point out that maybe income inequality isn't rising quite as quickly as it appears. And by the way, maybe the timing of the increases in income inequality doesn't quite fit a lot of the popular descriptions. For example, there's some people who argue that a lot of income inequality increases that a lot of people believe in the year that happened in the 2000s. A lot of critics argue maybe not so much. Maybe the increase in inequality was really slowing down in the 2000s. Now, if you watch the news or you listen to other experts, they'll tell you the exact opposite, which really kind of brings me to my last point. A lot of these arguments are contested, they're open-ended, and there's not general agreement on exactly on how much income inequality has increased or why it has increased. Well, that's kind of where we're going to leave off for right now. And in our next video, we're going to consider some other things regarding income inequality, or actually income mobility, social mobility in the United States. Thank you very much.